Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today is the first in a several-part video on the Bren gun. We're going to look at the origins of the Bren gun and its original early production today, and then in a follow-up video a little bit later, we'll talk about things that were done to it during World War II, modifications and improvements, and we'll follow that up with a third part on the 7.62 NATO conversion of the Bren. So, to begin with, the nicest, really, Bren gun. This goes back to the 1920s, not surprisingly. After World War I, the British military was interested in finding a replacement for its Vickers guns and its Lewis guns. And they kind of tinkered around through the 1920s. They tested pretty much all of the guns that came out in the 20s, but there was no real concerted trials program. It was just, oh look, the Châtellerault has, there's a Châtellerault machine gun, let's take a look at that, and then let's take a look at the BAR. And by the way, they really liked the BAR. In the years right after World War I, everyone really liked the BAR, but was never actually adopted by the British. It wasn't until 1930 that there was an actual formal push for, okay, we're going to have a trial and we're going to find a new light machine gun. And in particular, this new light machine gun was going to be tasked with replacing both the Lewis as a light machine gun and the Vickers as a heavy machine gun. And this is not an out-of-place requirement. This is exactly what the Germans would do, creating a universal machine gun with both heavy and light employment methods. However, the British were going to do it with a box magazine fed gun. Incidentally, the third part of the requirement is they also wanted the gun to be mountable on vehicles, carriers or armored fighting vehicles, what would eventually become the universal carrier, aka the Bren gun carrier, a little tiny tracked utility vehicle that you could mount a gun on. At any rate, in 1930, they start this actual serious program, and they kind of test all the usual suspects again. They try to test the Darn, but they aren't able to get them in time. They test two versions of the Browning, which is to say the BAR. They test the KE7 from SIG. The control that they're testing against is the Lewis gun. The Vickers wouldn't play a role in this, so they were definitely, while they wanted the new gun to take over both heavy and light roles, they were really focusing on the light here, at least in the testing program. And then they also tested this thing out of Czechoslovakia, the ZB-26, which by the time they got them was actually a ZB-27 with a few little improved features. And in the first trial, I should also add, they also tested the Madsen gun in 303 and the Vickers-Berthier. And the trials reports are kind of interesting because you can almost just see mustaches twitching in excitement through some of these trials reports, because this Czech gun did just magnificently well, much to everyone's surprise as far as I can tell. The initial trial was about 12,500 rounds. Between everything that was done for the various guns. The ZB came through that with no parts breakage and 2 malfunctions, both of which could be tied to magazines. Now at this point, this is a gun that is in 8mm Mauser. The British, of course, want a .303 caliber gun, but 8mm is what the ZB was being made in, and there wasn't, in early trial, they were perfectly happy to take a different caliber. So by the end of this first 1930 trial, they eliminate all but 3 guns. They're very excited by the ZB-26 or 27, but they're also fairly happy with the Vickers-Berthier and also the Madsen gun. They don't like the handling of the Madsen, but it ran fairly reliably. The Vickers-Berthier also showed a lot of promise. So they decided to come back a year later and do a new trial. And for that trial, they specifically wanted a .303 caliber gun. So the Brno factory was willing to oblige them, and in 1931 sent a .303 converted gun, so a .303 barrel, .303 magazine. And it should be noted at this point that the ZB that they were working with was very much like a ZB-26. It had a gas piston that came all the way out here to the very end of the barrel. And they liked that feature because what it meant in the original guns was that the bullet has to come all the way down to here before gas is tapped out of the barrel and starts to move the action, which means it's a fairly soft shooting gun because the action of the action of cycling is delayed until just about the time the bullet has left. It's delayed about as long as it can be. The M1 Garand is similar in this respect. However, what they discovered in this 1931 trial is the gun actually didn't do quite so well, It had problems ejecting, which they attribute to a relatively rushed conversion program to 303. It had problems with the magazine. 303 is a rimmed cartridge, 8mm is rimless. Converting this sort of conversion is going to be one that's going to be a little difficult. They also discovered that the gas port being way out here didn't work all that well with specifically British ammunition, because the British are using cordite because they just have to be a little different. And it fouled a lot more than it should have because of that. What's interesting to me is the British testing, the Ordnance Testing Board was so enamored with the gun that they kind of just didn't care. I mean, obviously they cared, but normally problems like that would be an easy cause for, all right, gun's out of the trial, forget it. Doesn't feed, fouls up, we don't like it, get rid of it. On this one, they were willing to give Bernot quite a lot of slack relative to what you would expect. And they basically said, oh, well, we know it was fantastic in the rimless 8mm version. It just, take it back, spend a little more time, tweak it a little more, and we'll look at it when you've got it fixed up a little bit. Because, boy, we really want this gun, is pretty much what you can read in the reports. By the end of this trial, they pretty much ditched the Madsen. They weren't happy with it for a bunch of reasons, and frankly, it was a very old design by that point. 1932 comes around, and they get another revised version of the ZB. This is now the ZGB Great Britain 1932 or 32 pattern gun. The magazine's been improved. They've moved the gas port back to about this point where it would remain in the final Bren version. They run another 19,000 rounds through the gun, and they have something like 6 malfunctions, all of which could be cleared by just hitting the charging handle, and like one of them was just a rim lock issue, and they're thrilled. But there are still a few things that they want better. They want a better tripod setup, because remember, they still have this idea that it'll replace the Vickers gun in service as well, and the way to do that is to mount the thing on a tripod and have an optic on it, which, by the way, they request an optics bracket, and we'll talk about that when we look at the gun up close. So they want a better tripod, and they also want 30-round magazines, because at this point, what Bernot had given them was a 20-round magazine, which kind of makes sense. In 8mm, basically in all of its other iterations, the ZB-26 family uses a 20-round magazine. Well, the Brits wanted 30, so okay. The ZGB-33 pattern gun arrives the next year, and it's the same gun. They've just, like, literally the same test gun, and they've just modified it back. It now has 30-round mags. It now has tripod attachment points, which we'll also take a look at in a moment. And the British do some more testing, and this is pretty much good to go. They discover some problems with the Vickers-Berthier that they don't like, so they chuck that out of the trials, and they've pretty much set themselves up with what will become the Bren, the ZB gun. Just for kicks, they take a second example of the gun, not the one that's already been run through all these trials and modified, but a second model, and they do a 150,000 round endurance test on it, kind of just to see what breaks. And it broke a bunch of recoil springs over the course of that, but they said they didn't ever notice until they'd stop to do a routine cleaning on the gun as part of this trial, and they'd pull it open and go, oh, the recoil spring broke. Huh, we didn't notice. Throw it out, put in a new one. At a little over 140,000 rounds, the slide, the kind of the lower receiver, if there is such a thing on this, it broke. Again, didn't stop the gun, but it broke. So they fixed that, and they added a little bit of metal to that part in the schematic for when they started full-scale production. And again, they were just really pretty much beside themselves with how wonderful this light machine gun was. So in 1935, the British government signs a contract with Bernot to license manufacture of what will become known in 1935 as the Bren gun. That is BR for Bernot, the factory in Czechoslovakia where it was developed, and EN for Enfield, the factory in England where it's going to be manufactured. The licensing contract will run until 1949, and the first 17,000 guns they'll pay a £3 license fee on. That drops down to £2 by the time they've gotten to 40,000 guns. They are allowed to make them in, according to this licensing contract, in the UK, in its dominions and its provinces, and also Sudan. They never did set up production in Sudan, and they're allowed to sell them also to Sudan and Iraq, which is a British protectorate at that point. But they can't go selling these things off on the commercial market elsewhere. Production would take a little while to ramp up. The first thing they had to do was convert all of the drawings to inch, because they had been done in Czechoslovakia in metric. dimensions, and there's a little bit of a flub there. The original Enfield production gun turns out to be not quite interchangeable because they kind of mess up the conversion. This leads to something called the Enfield inch, which is not quite a regular standard inch, hence the issues. That's a separate issue we can get into later. By 1938, production actually starts. So they get the first official Bren Mark I, manufactured as basically a proof sample in Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1937. Enfield has production started up by September of 1938, or September of 37, and in 1938, the first guns actually come off the line. So let's take now, having spent a lot of time going through the backstory of this thing, let's take it apart. Let me show you how this actually works. The Bren is widely, and I think pretty rightfully, considered basically the best light machine gun of this period, the best light machine gun of the light machine guns that were made in this style. And by that, I'm referring to guns that are magazine fed, not belt fed, and fired off a bipod instead of off a tripod. There's kind of a heyday of these guns from the 1920s through the 1940s before everyone decided to adopt the German universal machine gun idea. The Mark I Bren is a rather fancy and feature-rich sort of gun. So we have a stabilization handle back here. So your shooting hand, your strong hand, goes on the pistol grip, and your support hand holds this to help control the gun. It is mounted in what is actually also a tripod mounting. So this pin unlocks, and this one's pretty stiff here. With that lifted all the way up, the rear carry handle comes out, a rear support handle. You can see here the style of socket. So when you drop this onto a tripod, there's a lug right there, and then you push this pin back through, lock it in place, and that locks the gun down onto the tripod. We also have a folding shoulder rest up here, so you can flip that down. There's some question as to how useful these really are, but it does give you something to pull the back of the gun down onto while you're firing. This is marked Bren Mark I right here on the side. And this is a very early example, manufactured at Enfield. You got the Royal Cipher there, and the date, 1939. This style of marking would change a bit before too long. And the serial number is here on the back end of the receiver. These were initially made in single prefix batches of 10,000, so A, B, and C. This gun was one that was actually produced, well, obviously made in 1939, produced before Dunkirk. Obviously this one survived Dunkirk. We have, of course, a 30-round magazine. There are a pair of grooves stamped into the magazine here. This one is to control the rims of the cartridge to make sure that they don't cause rim lock. This one is, of course, to control the shoulder and keep the bullets pointed in the right direction. There is a hold-open tab here. This will lock open when the magazine is empty. The gun fires from an open bolt, which we'll get to in a moment. There is a folding, non-reciprocating charging handle here on the Mark I pattern. There is also a dust cover that goes over the magazine well. There's a little ball detent here that holds it in the open or closed position. Pop right there. There is also a sliding dust cover on the bottom. If you push that, you have to open it up to actually shoot so that you have an ejection port, but if you're not actively using the gun, you can close that up and prevent any dirt from getting in the bottom. The barrel change mechanism is extremely simple. We have a locking lever here. There's a little spring-loaded button on the inside, shielded, by the way, so you don't bump it accidentally. Lift that up about not quite 90 degrees. And then, using the nice big handle, you simply pull the barrel forward out of the gun. It uses an interrupted thread, and that's what this lever actually is. It's the other half of this interrupted thread. So lift it up, barrel slides out, lock down, barrel stays in place. We have a front pin here, just like the one that held the rear stabilization handle in place. This is the front attachment point for the tripod. The bipod normally sits like this. You can rotate the bipod 90 degrees over, slide it right off the gun. This one's got a little bit of grease in it, but the legs can extend and retract. And of course, when this is mounted in the gun, you can fold the legs back and fold them either, well, fold them together and then fold them either back or forward, whichever you prefer. There's a lot to go over on this gun. On the other side, we have a selector switch here. This is marked A, S, and R, and that is automatic in the front position, safe in the middle position, and R for repetition, which is semi-auto fire in the back. There are two dovetail mounts on the side of the gun. The rear one holds the iron sights, which we'll look at in a sec. The front one was intended for an indirect fire sight, as well as a telescopic sight that was in development. Now, we'll talk about the indirect fire sight separately because a few of those do exist, and we have access to one, but that's a little beyond the scope of this video, which is already getting long. The story on the magnified optic, the telescopic sight for this, is that it was planned, and basically in the aftermath of Dunkirk, the whole idea was scrapped. They wanted to simplify the guns. The scope, the original idea was to use the number 32 scope and mounting bracket that are the same as what would go on the number 4 rifle sniper patterns. The idea being you'd have the same scope and the same mounting, you just swap them between sniper rifles and light machine guns as long as you had the little mounting bracket for each. But the whole idea got scrapped. As far as I know, none of the Bren mounting systems were actually ever made. And it's only very early guns that have the second dovetail for that telescopic sight. Now, the iron sights here are based on a rotary wheel, and as you crank this, the rear aperture sight is going to lift up. You have an aperture sight here, and then your range markings are on this wheel. If we can get the light right, you can see that there. So it tells you your range setting as you rotate the wheel up. It's a fairly complex, there you go, 2, 3, 4, etc. Sorry, there's some old oil in there as well. Fairly complicated rear sight setup, but it works well. Looking at the barrel, I'm going to come back to the handle in just a moment. We have a gas block out here on the barrel. It is adjustable. You've got 4 different settings, and they're indicated by the different size holes there. To change settings, you simply take the barrel off and rotate it to whatever setting you want. There is a little tab here on the front of the piston that will slide into this, and that ensures that the gas block, the setting there is properly aligned so the gun will function. If you want to take the gas block out, or the gas port system, you just rotate this to where it's kind of halfway in between settings, and then it just drops out of the gun. And then I drop it on the table. The front sight here is, of course, offset to the left, and that's to match the offset to the left rear sight, which is done because the magazine's centered in the top of the gun, so you can't have the sights in the middle. As a practical matter, this doesn't really cause any significant issues. It's a little awkward for a left-hander to shoot, but you can actually roll your head over the top of the stock, and it's not really a big deal. Just minor note, there's a lightning cut on the front sight tower of the barrels that were made by Enfield, but not by Inglis, so that's kind of just a little identification trick there. And then, of course, one of the distinctive features of the Mark I Bren is this stainless steel flash hider or gas block assembly. The original idea here was that where this is currently pinned in position permanently or semi-permanently, this was originally going to be a threaded-on component. So the barrel itself actually comes all the way out to here. You can see the muzzle end of it right there with some grease and gunk in there, sorry. And the original point was this slid on, the stainless steel was more corrosion resistant, so it would help prevent fouling as well as rust in the gas system. And then if you had problems, you could just change this out instead of having to change out the entire barrel. This pin would have originally been basically a removable spring clip that you could like rotate out, pull the pin out, and then you could unthread this off of the barrel itself. The other thing that they wanted to do with that was make a blank firing version of this flash hider assembly, gas block and hider assembly, that would be correctly gassed for blank firing. It would have the appropriate restrictor in the front already, and that would make for a nice, simple, elegant blank firing system. They didn't ever actually do that. In fact, I have a version here that we'll take a look at in a separate video of the actual blank firing system that they used. But that's why this is this distinctive separate material, separate component out here. there's one other little feature I want to show you because it's kind of cool. The barrel carry handle, of course, stands vertical like this for pulling the barrel off or for carrying the gun, and then it folds down to the side when you're actually shooting. However, you can also pull the handle back and it will unlatch, and you push this all the way down and then rotate it forward like so. This one doesn't want to snap back in, but what happens is this little tab locks into a rail in the front of the receiver here, and holds this solidly in the downward position. And this was intended for helping to control the gun with your support hand when you were using it in an anti-aircraft role, lifted up on a tripod. It would also be used by troops for firing the thing from the hip, supported on a sling, and you have your primary hand back here on the grip and your support hand up on the front grip. And it's a neat sort of assault fire style of carry handle setting. All right, I've got a second example here that I'm going to pull apart to show you the internals because it's a little happier coming apart. So first, pull the mag off. Second, it's easy. We're going to pop the handle, pull the barrel off. Next step, we can rotate this down on its side, and the bipod comes off. There is then just one pin holding this gun together, and it is a captive pin. And if I pull that out, I can then pull the whole bottom trigger assembly frame off of the gun. So this has that sliding dust cover in it, right there. This has the trigger mechanism. The recoil spring is captive inside the buttstock, so it just has this extension rod that is going to push on the bolt, the bolt carrier. Once I have that bottom assembly off of the gun, then I can just pull the bolt carrier out. So gas piston, bolt carrier, the bolt lifts right off like that. We have a spring-loaded firing pin in there, and that's the whole thing field stripped. This is legitimately one of the fastest and easiest light machine guns to disassemble, reassemble. There are no small parts to lose, and it is truly a really elegant design. Mechanically, this is of course identical to the ZB26. In a nutshell, this is a tilting bolt. So as the whole assembly is going forward, it pushes a cartridge in. These two prongs pick up a cartridge from the magazine. When the cartridge is fully chambered, the bolt will stop, but the recoil spring continues to push the operating rod forward, and you can see the little ramp here, which pushes the back of the bolt up. So this is the locked and in battery position. And what's going on there is this shiny surface at the top is locking into a recess in the top of the receiver. Namely, it's locking right in front of this piece. This is a hardened locking block. You can see it's got a little peened screw there. This can actually be replaced. So if the headspace grows too excessive, you can put a larger locking piece, locking shoulder would be the term, in there and put the gun back into service. This tongue right here is the ejector. So when the bolt comes all the way back carrying an empty cartridge, the ejector will slide again between those two little rails on the top. It will kick the cartridge out of the bolt face and push it straight down where it ejects here out the bottom of the gun. In fact, there is this big old hole. So when the gun is in position to eject, this is lined up with the very bottom of the receiver right here and gives you an ejection port. When the bolt's forward, that ejection port doesn't exist, but it doesn't matter because the bolt's not trying to eject. Now, the way this actually fires is you have your loading chambering sequence, so the bolt's going to come up, track backwards, and when it gets all the way into the locked position like this, this surface on this little tower is going to hit that right there, which is the firing pin. That is going to protrude out the bolt face. And yes, it is basically a rectangular firing pin, not a round one. That's going to protrude out the face and fire. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this fires from an open bolt. So it is normally in this position. The whole thing goes forward, chambers, fires. We can, yeah, there we go. There's the firing action with the bolt mounted. And then the gas block taps gas into the front of this piston, which is going to push the whole assembly backward. The first thing that's going to happen, the bolt is locked in place, so the op rod is going to come backward, and then the ramp on this hook is going to act on this surface at the back of the bolt, which pulls it down, just like that. It's then out of battery, and then the whole thing can reciprocate backward, extract, and then eject the empty cartridge. By the time Dunkirk happened, the British had manufactured about 30,000 Bren guns. By the way, they had also fired up production at the John Inglis company. They'd contracted with John Inglis in Canada to manufacture Brens. By 1938, it was kind of evident that war was a-coming, and they wanted to have redundant manufacture outside of the British Isles. So these would be manufactured by Enfield and by Inglis initially. So they had about 30,000 when Dunkirk happened. In the process of evacuating the BEF from mainland Europe, they managed to lose about 27,000 of their 30,000 Bren guns, and that put them in a serious small arms shortage in the aftermath of Dunkirk. That, combined with some issues that came out in the early stages of World War II, using these in combat, they found some issues, fouling issues with the gas system and a number of other things. This would lead to a desire to modify the design, which would lead to a modified version and then a Mark II version of the Bren gun. We will cover those in a future video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.